Hi, this is Kerry with Filmmaker Central, and today we're going to talk about the 180 degree rule with regards to shutter speed in video. Now, what we want to accomplish is just the right amount of motion blur in order to make the shot look smooth. It's going to look more natural to the eye. If you shoot at too fast of a shutter speed, what's going to end up happening is you have a gap between each frame. And the result, when you play it back, is a very staccato or very jerky look. Now, sometimes you might use that for artistic reasons, but generally we want to stick with the 180 degree rule. Now, simply put, what we're going to do is we're going to take our frame rate and double it for our shutter speed. If we're shooting at 24 frames per second, ideally we would like 1/48th of a second shutter speed. Now, most cameras won't do that. They'll do 1/50th of a second, which is fine. It's close enough. So take that up to 30 frames per second. We would want 1/60th of a second shutter speed. If we're shooting slow-mo at 120 frames per second, we would want 1/240th of a second shutter speed. Now, let's take an example to see how this actually works. So here I have a bicycle wheel, and I'm going to start spinning it, and we're shooting at 24 frames per second at 1/50th of a second, and we get this nice smooth look to those spokes. There's just enough motion blur there. Now, when we crank it up, you'll see a big difference. So even going faster, it's still nice and smooth. Here at 1/400th of a second, it actually kind of looks like it's going backwards at times, and we see all those spokes in a lot of detail, but it just doesn't look right. It looks just all jerky and jittery. So side by side, we can see the real difference here. Nice smooth motion at double the shutter speed, and very jerky look at a very fast shutter speed. Now, very often, if we're in bright sunlight, we're not going to be able to do this easily and still get our exposure right. Even at 1/100 or even at ISO 100, you're shooting at 24 frames per second, 1/50th of a shutter speed. That's pretty slow, and you're going to get a lot of light. And that's where neutral density filters come in. Now, I've talked about neutral density filters in detail in some reviews of neutral density filters and why this is important, but I really want to stress that getting this stuff to look right is very dependent upon that shutter speed. Now, what ND filter do you need? It depends on how bright it is. If, let's take a simple example of something like the Osmo Pocket or the Osmo Action. These have no aperture. So the only way to control the light, if we're at the lowest ISO and at the correct shutter speed, is going to be a neutral density filter. Now here in Colorado, it's very bright, very, very bright. And if I'm using these cameras, which have like an f2 to f2.8 aperture, which basically means they're wide open, I'm going to let a lot of light in. So I'm going to have to run a fairly dark neutral density filter. Very often, that means an ND64. So that's very bright. Now with a DSLR or a mirrorless camera such as my A7 III, now I was out over the weekend shooting in very bright conditions, and I was running an ND16, and it was just fine. Now, there was some points of the day where all the clouds disappeared and it was super bright, and I actually had to go to an ND64 on that because I wanted to maintain a certain aperture range. I didn't want to go into f11, f22, something like that. I wanted to be like f5.6, and so I did go with a little darker of an ND filter than I would normally use. So keep this in mind when you're filming, to make sure whatever frame rate you're shooting at, you use double that as your shutter speed to make sure you get the correct motion blur. Well, that was a tongue twister there. Shutter speed and frames per second are really confusing sometimes for people. But keep this in mind. It's called the 180 degree shutter rule, and it's going to make your footage look more cinematic. So that's it for the 180 degree shutter rule here at Filmmaker Central. Watch it and subscribe, like if you want. Be sure and check out all the things that are going on at filmmakercentral.com. This has been Kerry. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.